Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the AlphaList podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today with me, I have David Cramer, and David is the founder of Sentry. David, hey.
Hey, great to be here.
I hope you're good, and I think there's not so much needed as an introduction for you, actually, because I guess everyone here knows Sentry, right? But maybe a few words. Like I think I googled, like you secured over 200 million in funding, etc., and you are at over 100 million in ARR. Is that correct?
Yeah. What's the easiest way? Sentry is a late stage startup, I would say at this point. Yeah, I don't know how much funding, but it's a lot. We make a bunch of money. We publicly announced that we have over 100,000 customers on our cloud service. Customers being like sort of companies that use it, and we're north of 100 million in revenue, or at least I think we said ARR. I forget. And yeah, I don't know. We're sort of a big company, but not too big. We're like 350, 400 people, and so we're turning error monitoring into a big deal, I guess.
And like looking back, before you started. Like, what was your idea on error monitoring? And I mean, did you imagine it could grow so much?
Ooh, yeah. I don't know. So I think I remember this conversation when we raised money. We had a couple thousand customers, under $1 million in revenue, so we're bootstrapped. I remember this conversation with our investor right after he joined, maybe right before he invested. I'm not sure, somewhere around there, where we plotted out how to get to 100 million in revenue. And I remember just rolling my eyes when we had that conversation, as in I'm like, this is, very unlikely or something. I'm like, it doesn't make any sense to me. And so I would say, no, we didn't imagine it. But what venture teaches you, like when you raise venture capital, is you have to think big. You have to build a really big business. Otherwise, you shouldn't raise capital, And so, probably a few years later, that ambition changed. There was like a little bit more evidence that we could grow it. But even when you're like at 10 to 20 million, you're still very, very far from something like 100 million. And it's such a different thing. And I often wonder, the things that I thought were sort of easy to manage back then, or easy approaches to problems, I often wonder if those still work. I keep trying to apply them, to be clear. And at the same time, I often wonder if it's as complex as people make it out to be. Like I think, we've had a lot of success with product market fit. And so growth has been fairly natural, which is a great problem to have, but it's still a problem. Because once you're trying to, grow at the scale we are, things are a little bit more difficult, I would say.
Okay. Maybe starting a bit earlier than with Sentry, I always ask my listeners, I always ask my guests, not my listeners, about their nerd path, their journey into how they got where they are. Like how did you get where you are? Like why did you actually start with engineering, etc.? What is your background story?
Yeah, so honestly, I just like building things, and I don't know. It's always hard to say like why this specific thing, because as an example, like I like building things. There's a lot of different ways you can build stuff. Software isn't the only one. I think there's like, it's right time, right place. And so I think like when I was a teenager, the internet was in like the glory days when it was still the Wild West. Not everything was figured out. There was a lot of opportunity. It was very rough. I mean, this was the era of like GeoCities and IRC and all this stuff it was very, say, unmoderated.
Yeah.
And capitalism had not yet taken full effect of it.
The time of the marquee and the center tag, right?
Yes. The blink tag.
The blink tag.
Yeah. And I think what the big deal though was it was like super accessible. There was no like gatekeeping of any shape or form. And I mean that not in the sense of like people intentionally gatekeep it, like to build a technology or a technology company even, it was actually not that difficult. Like technology was far worse, but the internet was small. The complexity was small. Security wasn't really a thing people worried about. There was all these like different shapes of things. And so I feel like I was fortunate that I kind of had gotten hold of a computer and I was able to build these little applications on a LAMP stack, which was like PHP and MySQL back in the day. And, one thing led to another. And it was almost like this way where I don't consider myself a creative person in like the traditional light of like, art or music or anything like that. But there's also like creativity in software. And so it's kind of a way for me to express that. I would build like little hobby websites for video games where my first job, like paid job, was I reverse engineered World of Warcraft's data files and built a database out of it and published it on the internet. And that was super fun. I was a teenager. I was a like big gamer and stuff. I never really played World of Warcraft, but it was just cool. It was like really interesting. It was problem solving. It didn't require academics, like in the sense of, I'm a high school dropout, eventually college dropout. But I'm fully self-taught, and you can kind of figure it out. It's harder these days, mind you. But you can still kind of like teach yourself all this. You can be good at it. Like I would like to think I'm a pretty strong engineer, even though I have no formal training whatsoever, And that to me is a really, really big deal. There's few fields in the industry that you can say those kinds of things about, let alone ones where you can actually make significant amounts of money in your career,
So I think you just hit the right spot then, right?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit. I'm glad this is the industry I'm part of, and I guess actually to kind of further your question, like on Sentry, I'm glad Sentry's been successful, but I actually think there's tons of opportunity in tech in general for the folks that are ambitious, kind of capable of doing it, and Sentry is just one of the many things I built. I could have just as easily worked at, a bunch of other startups, which I have. Granted, most of them were not as successful as Sentry. But there's always a lot of opportunity in the industry for people that are driven and that have the capabilities. And a lot of the capabilities honestly just come from drive. Like, obviously, you've got to be able to figure it out. And I don't know if that's the right kind of brain or personality or whatever it is. But it's mostly just like, it's like a lot of hard work, right? And so like Sentry is just one of many things I built over the years, one of the many open source things. And it just happened to have a path monetization that worked. And it just happened to be a thing that had a really wide addressable market, And so there was a lot of opportunity in that, but I don't see it so much as like a luck or anything like that. Just more that when you're given the opportunity, you either take it or you don't take it. And there's a lot of chances, I guess, for opportunity. So, but yeah, I just, one of many things, and, started small, started without ambition, I guess, per se, without financial ambition, I would say. And then just, when you see something that like really sticks, and I guess also when you get older in life and you actually, want to have money to pay for things, you start thinking more critically about how you earn more money and stuff. So, but no, they're all good problems. But I think it's just, the internet's a really open place, and it's still, ignoring there's always hype waves around random stuff. Sentry is and was not ever like a sexy company, right? Like error monitoring, nobody finds.
Well, I would consider you like
it's fun to solve the problem, but
it's the sexiest of the error monitoring solutions out there from my perspective, and like we talk about that later as well, right?
I think we made it that way, to be fair, but like even the things we care about have nothing to do with enterprise software. Like we're big on brand and like visual marketing and all this stuff. There's so many, like look at Salesforce. They have brand now, but like it is not a nice piece of software to look at, let alone use most days. Wildly successful company, right? And so I think you make things interesting and you find reasons to do things, but solving error monitoring is like a sort of, actually, I guess what now will effectively probably be the equivalent of my life's work. It's not anything that I think is that interesting,
I think like for Salesforce, it can be considered a sign of success if people build systems on top of your systems that make your system visually more appealing. but you solved that yourself.
Sign of success, sign of opportunity. Yeah.
So you early on discovered that the design or more appealing side of things is part of your success, or can be part of your success. What was the moment, the key moment when you discovered that?
So I don't know. I value design, like in all things. I'm not capable of it in almost anything. I will say the things like Dolly and the LLMs of the world, I appreciate because they allow me to be slightly less incompetent. But I very much value, and not everybody does, to be fair. But I think it's like, think about interior design and stuff. Like we like having like sort of a better surrounding, or even like exterior, like landscaping, all these things in life. We like just surrounding ourselves with sort of more visually pleasing or more organized or whatever you want to think of it as. And I always value that in software and products and everything too, right? And so, whenever I build anything, in fact, I'm always trying to harass a designer to help me on it. And that was no different than with Sentry. And I think it's actually gotten easier over the years from a design point of view for engineers who are not creative in that regard to be able to do a better job with things like frameworks like Bootstrap or Tailwind components or any of these other forms, which is awesome. But it's just like something I valued, and we put it front and center. And I actually think the best organizations in the world these days do put design front and center at their companies, if nothing else, because it's a differentiator. But it's not even just design. Like I'm a big believer in brand marketing. And it's sort of just, it's how you represent yourself as a whole. Like, what are the values you stand for without like teaching them to somebody, right? Well, clearly Sentry puts a bunch of effort in design. So we must value design. And if you value design, you probably are like, oh yeah, I like that Sentry values design, And so in a lot of it, it was just like showing our values to the world. And it's the same reason like our marketing copy is like super cheeky, where we kind of just like belittle ourselves or make fun of whatever we do or something. It's because we think it's kind of a joke. It's a fun joke. But it's just us being like authentic in what we think is like how we should be instead of like being fake, I guess. And so it's the same kind of thing all wrapped up in this. It's just like how we think about our brand is our values and what we care about and how we want to represent ourselves,
Okay. And you reached a certain size and you raised a bunch of money for that to actually get there. And you mentioned that at the beginning you were basically bootstrapping and playing with open source, etc. If you could start from scratch, if you would be like let's say like $0 to $10 in monthly recurring revenue, what would you do differently, or would you just do it the same thing, same style again?
It's interesting because we struggle with this internally. Like, building one product is one thing, building a second product is an entirely another thing. And, I talked about opportunity. We had built something that had product market fit. Whether I knew that at the time, almost irrelevant, but there was clearly demand there. And I just kept building it, Manufacturing that is very different. But I think there's a couple things. So I can't give real advice, and I don't like to bullshit. And so what I can say is it's hard. I think you've got to have determination to like actually vet out if something's going to work or not. And one thing Sentry did from the beginning was we kind of knew there was demand. It was already open source back in the day, so like people could use it, and they were using it, which was helpful because we knew there was something there. But when we spun up the business and the cloud services, those cost us money, right? And we were bootstrapped. And I think partially because we were bootstrapped, we said, hey, it's only a paid service. There is no free tier. There is now, but that's different. And I actually think that was a really good move because it allowed us to effectively bootstrap, build the business in a time otherwise where it actually might have been hard for us to raise venture capital because of the kind of business we were, like open source, developer tools, all this stuff. But it also instilled this rigor in like, hey, it's a product. You pay for it. Like if it has value, you'll pay for it. And that's a really good forcing function. And so I think one thing I often see, so I invest in a lot of startups and I actually bias towards developer tools and open source. And those are two of the harder industries to get into. But I think one of the biggest challenges I see from people is they'll have something that's popular, like an open source thing. And there's probably a path to monetize it, but it's a little tricky. But they won't. Or they'll think it's kind of like straightforward to just like, maybe there's a way they'll get them over the line at some point. And I think the big mistake is just like, you got to charge right away. You got to find that value extraction mechanism to fund the business. And I think we were fortunate. The Sentry is pretty straightforward. It's infrastructure. We can cloud host it. We sell us hosting it to you. It's kind of a straightforward exchange. But it's really hard to get it to the point where you've got something that will generate real revenue. Even going back to like, did we ever think errors would be this big? We actually fully believed that errors would be small and we had to build many other products. We still believe we have to build many other products, and we do. But we were fully committed to the idea that it's got to be a suite of offerings because errors will never make $100 million on its own, kind of thing. That was our belief at the time. And, that's no longer my belief. But the premise of it was kind of, you can't, like, you almost actually have to be a pessimist about the business. You have to believe it's not going to succeed and you got to keep working at it or offer many other things and stuff. Because our thesis was you have to generate 100 million in revenue. That number might be bigger these days for what it's worth. But you have to generate that if you're raising venture capital. And if you cannot find a path to build a business that is that big, you are fooling yourselves into like kind of what you're doing, right? And so we're like, well, how would we possibly? And that was just the exercise. And the advantage we have is there's an established market in our space, the APM industry, things like New Relic or AppDynamics or Datadog or something. They all kind of sell in this rough space. So there's clearly money to be made there. It's a little bit different than like a greenfield space. But I think that's also true for most markets if you like look at them like carefully. And so I don't know, it's really tough to get to product market fit, but I think you got to charge right away. And I will say, like, every day we were looking at the new customers numbers, like who's paying us today? Is there another person today? Are there 3 more people today? Are there 5 more people today? And we tracked it to the point of view where we tracked MRR, not ARR, because it was like, it would move at like a weekly level in small increments. And MRR is like, it's kind of an interesting way to constantly see it moving in a scale where you see little numbers fluctuate a lot more. And we were super hands-on with customers, which you got to be, obviously. Like they always say, like early stage, you're just like, you are the salesperson, which is true. I'm not a salesperson by any means, but I was selling the product even if I didn't realize it. Even if I was just going out, hanging out with my peers, talking about what I was building, it was still sales. And so I think you just got to be hyper-focused on that stuff.
But still, what would you do differently? Nothing, or?
I would never change anything because I believe in the challenge of paradoxes. Like if I change one thing, what happens? I do think if I did another company, which I thought about a lot one day, if I were ever just, I don't really want to do another company because it takes a lot of effort. Like this is year, I don't even know. I've been like full time on Sentry for 10 years now, right? And the project's older than that. So I don't want to spend another like 15, 20 years of my life just to experiment, but I would love to try different things before, because some of the interesting things about Sentry, so Sentry is a largely self-serve bottoms up business.
Yeah.
PLG. I think we say we have 60,000 paid accounts, something like that, paid customers. And I'm not sure if this is public, but it's fine. About 70% of our revenue, and there's a margin of error in there, comes from self-serve, from people just swiping the credit card. And that is rare in the IT enterprise space, right? And to me, that is like an awesome accomplishment. I'm like, what if it was 100%? How much more efficient? Because I'm a big believer in efficiency. It's why I like tech. How much more efficient could you run a business if it was 100%? Like, if you take a lot of traditional business, sales is a really big cost. And it has ROI, but the ROI is paid. You kind of like generate faster revenue, but you pay a lot of money to generate that revenue. And then you also have a little bit of this challenge where, sometimes you don't, and it's a really big expenditure. And sometimes it takes many years. So you need a lot of capital up front. And I'm like, well, what if everything was self-serve? Like, one, could you do it? Could you build $100 million or $1 billion revenue business purely from self-serve, particularly in a space that is not traditionally that? And could you do it and still capture the same market segment? And what I mean by that is often like big enterprise customers. Okay, sorry, I was frozen a little bit.
Big enterprise customers?
Make sure we're still working.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay. Big enterprise customers they have these annoying needs, but the needs are kind of manufactured. But what they need is kind of a human, right? They need that human point of contact.
Yeah.
And there's some reasons for why it's valuable, of course, but I don't know if you could capture that segment of the market without a sales team or that like kind of something that was more of we call it touch sales approach. But either way, I would love to see how big you could build a fully self-serve business. That would be an interesting thing. Again, I wouldn't change, but I would love to alternate reality, see what would happen. I think the other thing that would be interesting is, and this is more of a recent lesson, is like trying to take more focus and doing less and keeping the team smaller. Because one of the biggest challenges I've seen from building a company is literally just people. It's the more people you have, the more complexity, the more logistics you have to deal with, communication gaps, all these other problems, right? Career tracks, all like infinite variations of things that happen the more people you add. And I'm like, well, how far could you get with a tiny team? And a lot of businesses have shown us you can get very, very far. And private equity shows us you can get very, very far as well, right? Now, a lot of times private equity is taking something that's already built, mind you, so the R&D cost is paid. But I do think there's a lot of, again, going back to inefficiency, I think like in general, Silicon Valley operates companies very inefficient. And we do it because, frankly, we're just lazy. We do what has worked before because we're not trying. Like our goal is not like build a new innovation model for building a business. Our goal is to build a business, right? But I do think it would be interesting to like challenge a lot of the status quo. And we've done some of that at Sentry, mind you, with like big self-serve business, the open source thing, even though technically we're not open source for the majority anymore. But there are like a lot of these interesting ideas that if you just reason through them from first principles, there's no reason they shouldn't work. And so I don't know. It's, again, I wouldn't change anything, but I think there's a lot of different ways I would love to see people approach businesses versus just the run of the mill, copycat enterprise company.
It sounds as if you're a bit tired of venture capital as well, and you would, if you would have the chance, also build a bootstrap business alone in your basement and scale it up to, let's say, 2 million in ARR and only have your server costs and yourself as like base costs. Is that true?
Maybe not that far, but like what I've talked about, because I always hypothesize like, what will I do one day post Sentry? And I'm like, it'd be really fun. Get you and your 10 best friends that are really, really skilled at sort of their domain and just build sort of a private equity company. And the reason I say that is because there's sort of this size of business you can manage, right? And I'm like, well, how big of a business could you manage with 10 people that are very skilled at their craft, right? And I'm like, could you build a $100 million business off that? Okay, maybe not. There's a lot of moving parts at that point, but could you build, a $10 million or a $20 million business? 100%. Like, absolutely, Most people to get to 20 million in revenue, they've got 100 employees or something along those lines. And you definitely do not need that level of scale. And so that's how I would prefer it. One, because I don't have every skill under the sun. Two, it's a lot of hard work. Three, it's lonely. Like you actually want, like, you need a peer group to collaborate with on stuff. And I very much think a lot about like at least for folks like me, your work is kind of your life in the sense of like all of my friends are people I've worked with or I know through work. Half of them have, half of my friends at this point have either worked at Sentry or still work at Sentry. And whether people like it or not, your social bonds are the people you spend the most time with, and so I would want to keep those kinds of things. And I just think it would be really interesting to do it at a smaller scale, but with big ambitions still.
And you yourself, you pivoted role-wise from like calling yourself a founder to a CTO, now a CPO. So you seem to be like all over the place, I guess, as a founder always is. Like, what did lead you to that change in roles?
Yeah, so one of the great advantages about being a founder, if you don't have ego, or rather, if you have a moderate amount of ego, not too much ego, is you can just change your job and still have a huge amount of impact, a huge amount of influence over the company, right? Like, if you ask anybody internally at Sentry, like I hired a CEO, must be almost 5 years ago or even 5 years ago now. I don't feel like I lost any influence in the company whatsoever from stepping down from the CEO role. And technically the CEO is my boss, to be clear. I feel like in a lot of ways in day-to-day interactions, even though like CEO makes the final call, we are more peers, if anything. And it brought in somebody else that was a partner to work with, that could do more. And I didn't like doing a bunch of the job. And so that was the other big thing. So for me, when I actually transitioned out of CEO, I'm like, I want to find somebody who's better at it than me, that wants to do the things I don't like doing, which is like hiring executives, raising money, even though raising money has not been that hard in the last few years. It's just these things I didn't like spending my time on, right? And this recent transition from CTO to CPO has kind of been the same. Like there was already people running most of the company under me, and I was mostly focused on like strategic conversations and product vision and things like that. But I'm like, it'd be great if I could find somebody that wanted to do that job and again, be another peer in the company that could help us do even more. And I would say also did it this time. Like our new CTO is phenomenal. And it was another way where I could be like, okay, now I can focus on this other thing. And the way I've always thought about this over the years, because people talk a lot about burnout and stuff and ignoring exactly what that means. The way I think about my career path at Sentry is you go through like highs and lows, right? And oftentimes the highs, I'm like super on, I'm cranking through stuff. It feels like the return on my time is amazing, right? It also feels like I never have enough time when that happens. And the lows, I feel like I'm not doing anything. And I'm actually probably not doing that much work or something like that when that happens, you know? And often what I've recognized is when those lows happen, I just change what I'm like. That's how I will like sort of re-energize or re-engage. I'll like switch projects, or I'll choose to spend my time on something else at the company. And I think some of that is manifested in also me like hiring folks to do jobs that I used to do, right? And so, you know, I was burnt out from hiring marketing executives effectively. And so I'm like, I'm going to hire a CEO and it can be their problem now, among other things, right? And the CTO, I'm like, you know, I really don't want to manage, you know, 150, 200 person EPD org and sort of like manage the organization of that in the sense of like managing how we communicate and structure goals and all this other stuff, you know? What I do want to do is run some experiments and still be involved and things like that. So it was another one of those things that just allowed me to shift my focus. And so now I have like, other than I have a few PMs that report to me, my role is arguably not a CPO. It's a C-suite title that I could take on that allows me to still optically have that influence, you know, which unfortunately at like scale, you need the optics. But it also, you know, removed a lot of my reporting structure. And so there's a handful of folks that report to me, and most of them work on like random, let's call it experimental projects. And so it's not like I'm actually running the product org necessarily or anything like that. And so, and you'll also find this is fairly true with a lot of founders. It's like, especially when they're CTO founder, CTO is almost a meaningless role. And it's like, it's kind of all over the map what those jobs translate to. Like our new CTO, so much more like technical from an academic's point of view than I ever have been. And to me, it's phenomenal. It like adds so much more of a strength in that role than I had. But I also think they're a better leader than me, which is, you know, it's a double win in the case. And so I always look at it like opportunities to hypothetically get out of some work, but also level up the company. Usually it mostly just levels up the company and I still have just as much work for some.
So that means that you kind of run your experimental lab and you think you can innovate a lot still, or are you able to innovate a lot and influence the features that are actually being produced or delivered, or how is that now?
I think so. You know, when I look at what we're doing, so there are 3 organizations that report to me right now. To give you an idea of what I mean by this, I have a podcast, which is basically a marketing investment called Syntax. So that rolls up to me. I have the open source organization, which is mostly us just doing thought leadership and spending money on open source projects, like giving them money. And then I have this Hack Week project I built called Spotlight, which is like it's like as if you took the concept of Sentry and brought it into like the development environment so you could just view traces and all this stuff locally. To me, it's super useful and interesting. And I'm like, you know, I could just fund this project. Like I could just ask for headcount, get the headcount, and then hire people to work on it. And so that's what I did. And so I hired one person that used to work at the company. They came back and they've started working on it full time now. And there's going to be some more stuff like that in the future. So it's not actually gotten to the point where I'm building stuff, but I do spend a lot of time writing code in my spare time on a side project. And the company does use my side project as dog food, Sentry, for better or worse. And so I wouldn't say like I don't get a hack on stuff. I just like rarely do it at the company. And I think it's usually because within working hours, somehow I find a way to fill my time with stuff that seems to be stuff that I need to solve versus somebody else could solve, I guess, if that makes sense. So like lots of people can write code, you know, it's probably more valuable for me to spend time helping on direction and overall strategy than it is to do the implementation, even if I find the implementation very, very fulfilling.
Yeah, so I guess you still like live and breathe tracking, and you do it more than anyone else in the company, and you know the company best, and you can every once in a while just innovate, right? You can just run something which first sounds crazy, and experiment with it and play with it and get budget for it, which is different from someone who starts at zero. and that sounds like a nice job still, right?
It's good. And what I'm recognizing is I actually think the budget conversation, just as an analogy, is actually a really useful one. To where the point is, I can still give people freedom to do basically anything in product. But I asked one of the teams, I believe in this, like the budget thing is almost a good way to think about validation. So like we'll allocate a small budget, which is like 1 engineer, 2 engineers to like an experiment, but it should stop there. We should be able to validate from there and then go ask for real budget to like fund it in an ongoing way, right? And so as an example, this Spotlight thing I built during Hack Week. I sort of pressured people into helping me continue the effort to get it out the door, which is like 1 or 2 people kind of with some spare hours for a quarter or something. And then we're like, look, there's promise here. We believe in the strategic ROI. Let's add a headcount. Okay, maybe let's add 2 headcount in the future or something like that. And we're trying to do the same in a lot of our newer projects. But I do think the budget conversation it's just a really useful forcing function in the same way like bootstrapping your company is useful, that it's like, will people pay for it? Or can I get traction on something before I just like spend a year building something and, put 15 people on the project or something into that.
Cool. And how do you think, like your approach also, I mean, I guess you learned a lot about developer marketing. How would you describe your approach and why did it actually work? Like, did you experiment a lot, or did you just say, hey, we're building a nicer error tracking tool with a bit more design and just a bit nicer, and then that worked out? Or like, what did you do in developer marketing?
So I don't think I knew a lot of this early days. And so my general approach to product is almost like never be satisfied. I am a huge believer in negative feedback. It's like, tell me everything you hate about what I'm building, because that's the energy I need, because that won't tell me exactly what to do, but it'll tell me all the things that are frustrating you or the friction points or the objections. And then I can take that and synthesize it into whatever I think I need to do, right? And so that was me early days, was just like that kind of feedback collection over and over. And kind of, I would say back then versus now is very different in how we did marketing. Back then, I think all of our marketing, our growth has always been like word of mouth for one. So that's still true. But back then it was like, I would go to conferences. I would speak about stuff, not Sentry. Sometimes like sort of implicitly Sentry. I would talk about like how I bootstrapped an open source project into a company kind of thing. Or I'd talk about scaling Python applications or just random technology, right? But that was building my brand. My brand was attached to the company. So that meant people knew I did Sentry at the same time. They knew what Sentry was. And the first step in anybody buying your product is them being aware of the product, right? Like marketing is almost all awareness. You can't often force a sale, but if you're present and they know what you are when they have the problem, they will reach for your product. And so that's how I like sort of look back and analyze what happened, is like, they just knew what Sentry was. People had a use, they used it, right? We still try to do that same thing today, but obviously our marketing is wildly different. We have a lot of spend on search engines and other advertising. We have billboards and stuff. We do influencers, which is a super useful, at least in some spaces. Like in like developer tools now, it's becoming very, very valuable, right? It's all the same though. We're still trying for like broad brand awareness. Like, know what Sentry is, know what it does. So when you have a problem, you will reach for Sentry. And so same fundamental thing. It's just like, I guess the budget and the channels have like slightly changed. But I would also say the channels haven't exclusively changed because of the budget. I think in general, the market's changed over the years. I think you could still go to conferences and speak. Big brand reputation, super, super valuable. 10 years ago, there was no, influencer marketing or YouTubers in the developer tool space. It was an irrelevant market, let alone something like TikTok or anything like that, And so I think you always got to kind of be adapting. And again, I go back to my fundamental view on marketing is look at people that I stole this to be clear. There's a guy named Omar Johnson who was the former CMO of Beats by Dre, the headphone company. And I saw him speak one time, early Sentry career. And his whole analogy was they were competing with Bose headphones. His whole analogy was, who cares what Bose does? They're not that exciting. What would Porsche do? Or what would a real brand do that you respect and admire the brand of? Like, how would they think about this problem? And I took that to heart for like my entire career set at this point, And so when I look at like how Sentry does things, I'm like, well, what would a really exciting company do not what would a boring competitor do in this space. Like I think a lot about like, especially enterprise companies, the marketing is not very good. And so I'm more like, okay, what's like the really, really creative, or what's going to be that thing that makes you stand out? Because half the battle of awareness is just, attention. Like, can you get their attention? And so how are you going to get their attention? You could be a genuine thought leader, like provide expertise. Okay, that's one. You can do something cheeky or controversial even, that's one, right? But it's got to be something like that. And so as an example of this, our first billboard campaign, the premise of it was like a visual of something ludicrous that makes no sense. And it just says Sentry can't fix it. And the first one we did, it was a Minotaur playing Beat Saber. And it just says Sentry can't fix it. And you're like, I don't get it. What does Sentry do? What's going on? Is that a Minotaur? Are they playing? Is that VR? Is there something broken with that? And it just makes you ask questions, right? It captures the attention. And I remember when we did that, like half the company and a bunch of peers are like, how does this make any sense? How is this helping Sentry? You don't even say what Sentry does. And I'm like, that's entirely the point, because everybody's trying to sell you on some shit. We're just like, hey, Sentry's the same. If you're curious, go look it up, go figure it out, And I don't know. I just like, again, there's lots of ways you can do things, but that is a way that suggests like you have confidence that like you can capture people's attention and it's enough. And like an analogy I have is like, I really like Liquid Death as a great example of brand marketing, because they're not selling water. They're selling not beer is how I think about it. And their whole brand is like, it's just this like ridiculous stuff. Like, I don't even remember. They just have these funny names for products. And it's all, there's a post from them recently that I'd encourage you to look at if you're into this stuff, where they talk about how they value sort of stupidity in marketing in terms of their approach is just to do stupid things. Again, because they're just competing for attention. Like Liquid Death versus LaCroix versus the, 200 other brands of, water in a can. It's like, how do you win in that market? Well, every market looks like that market where there's infinite competition, And so you just got to find a way to stand out. And, building the best product helps. But one thing is never enough in any of these things.
Having the best billboard ad potentially helps as well. So what about having, we're a tech podcast, have a few CDOs as listeners and a few engineers as well. What excites you about current state of tech? Like, is your move away from the CDO also a bit of a, let's say, the realization that tech somehow got boring and you can't move the needle enough?
I've never been a technologist. I just like building stuff. And so I think I like writing code because it's very different than managing people, right? Like you're entirely in control of whatever happens at that point. And so even tech was always like almost like a means to an end for me. Again, I really enjoy it, mind you. But I also think some people are like lifelong hardcore technologists. I don't think I ever was or could have been that. I think I'm just very pragmatic. I'm often like, I want to solve the task and then I want to move on to the next task. And whatever the solution to that task is, that doesn't actually matter to me. And so I will say there's challenges with this, because going back to like, if I'm building the thing, I can visualize what I'm trying to build. I know exactly what I want the outcome to look like. It's really hard to communicate that to other folks. And so that's like a really annoying learning lesson as a founder, I would say. But again, I think it's just like what I desired was to build a really successful product, in the sense of like, I wanted everybody to use our product. I wanted validation that our product was the best, that it was really good. I wanted to do things in a way that I thought was more interesting, and that's like the self-serve thing, or our approach to like privacy or cloud services or whatever it is, But it was like less coupled to the technology. Like I think I'm pretty clever at building technology, in the sense of I take a lot of shortcuts and they, generally speaking, work really well. But that's very different than like building real technology. Like I think I'm a product person at the end of the day, more than I am like a technology person, even though my entire career was basically spent in infrastructure. And so it's kind of weird in that I'm in the CPO role now, because I would actually argue I'm probably a better product person than I am truly a technology leader. But there's this weird balance, I think, in all leaders that like it should be about making compromise over and over and over. It's never about like what is the most academically best solution to the problem. It's like, well, what is the best compromise we can make to get this done? And I think that's where my strength is. And I don't know. It's all kind of the same. You often hear about like technologists or people that are like senior in the engineering ladders move into management. They'll be like, oh, I actually enjoy this more. I like the people problem is more interesting. And I think it's the same thing. It's just like, they're all logic problems in different shapes of like, how do you solve this problem that's in front of you? And I think that's all it was for me. But yeah, I don't know. It's always an interesting dilemma, but it's also like, we've been doing Sentry for so long. Like, I think the project's 16-ish, 17, I don't even know. Well, it started a long time ago, right? So I've been at this quite a while. And I think one thing that keeps people like me interested is new problems to solve. And at least Sentry's core error monitoring, yeah, you could probably rebuild it, but it's solved pretty well. Like it's the problems that to take it to the next level are very, very difficult. They're not obvious, is what I would say. And I'm very good at solving the things that are kind of obvious, where it's like, there's a hole in the wall. Well, there's an obvious solution is to like make the hole go away, right? It's like you kind of know the different ways you could make the hole go away. And I think that gets harder and harder the more complex and advanced technology gets. And especially you look at these days with the rise of things like a lot more ML in the space, which is, I can reason about a lot of it, but again, I'm not academic, and that's an entirely different problem space to me. And it's like, I think that is going to be more of the future, right? Is more traditional academic. Like our jobs are not going away by any means, but I think the people that are very talented, that have like strong CS fundamentals, are going to succeed even more than they have in the past, because we kind of went through this era where everything was just like building simple web properties over and over and over and over. I think that's going to shift again, where that's still a thing that exists, but I think we're going to have a lot more hard CS problems once again in the industry, because I feel like those mostly disappeared. We invented CDNs. They were great. We invented complicated distributed databases. They were great. We invented cloud infrastructure. It was great. Okay. Most of the sort of core platform problems are kind of solved, it's like, and they shift a little bit, right? But now the problem is there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of these other challenges where how do you make sense of the data? And it's a lot fewer if statements is how I would think about it. And I'm really good at writing if statements.
If and go to, eh? So
I'm a Python, I guess JavaScript guy. We don't have go to.
Great. So it could also mean that the technologist of, let's say, yesterday, as I count myself to that group as well, is more like the CPO tomorrow, because you kind of learned how to shape the things, right? How to instruct machines to do what you want, right? And that middle layer, like that infrastructure layer, is better built by academics, as you just said, right? By the people who really want to solve a particular computing problem, a particular data problem, and not so much by the ones who just want to get something done, right?
I think so. I think the saving grace, actually, OpenAI is an interesting case study in this, because I know a lot of folks that work there. Some of them are very academic. Some of them are not academic whatsoever. And it's interesting because one thing I always saw in my career, because I was in infrastructure and distributed systems, is there were a lot of these hard problems, especially with distributed systems. And academics had really good ideas, but they were not viable ideas. They would never work in the real world because they could never scale to like thousands of nodes or anything like this, where the cost would be way too high or too slow or something, right? And so you always needed infrastructure folks, like practitioners, basically, right? And I think the split between the two was so wild that almost the academics very rarely had value. And I mean academics as in like pure researchers. It's interesting now because you look at a lot of the LLM and the modern ML stuff, and that's a lot of academics, but they're much closer to practitioners, and the practitioners are much more closely paired with them now. And so it's actually kind of interesting in the sense of, I think, like, expertise is going to become increasingly valuable in these worlds, because both implementing large scale infrastructure and implementing ML technologies are both hard problems, right? They're not, entry level CS stuff. But it's no longer say like that the academic is kind of impractical, or I don't know how you describe it, but like I see a lot more value in academics now in technology than there ever was in the past in my career. And so I think that's a good thing, but it's nice because it is paired with a lot of these practitioners, whatnot. And OpenAI's example is like, they just have a lot of both, right? They have the folks who will help implement stuff, They also have regular product people because they're building, I don't know, a chatbot or something, right? Which has nothing to do with the ML at the end of the day. And so it is kind of interesting to see. Again, it's going back to some of this hard computer science stuff, but also widening the industry a little bit at the same time.
I'd still be curious, like moving away from tech again, even if we just touched it shortly. How did your work-life balance change throughout the years? I mean, you do that for 15 years now. So I guess at the beginning it was just grinding, and I don't know if it in the middle and at the end was also just grinding. So I'd be curious if you still work 60 hours or like how much you actually spend on working, and how much that mixes up with your private life, let's say.
Yeah. I'm not a big believer in work-life balance. I think at the end of the day, you find ways to balance your life if you are in the kind of career that requires, a lot of your time. And I found ways to balance my life. Like I don't work, 15-hour days unless I want to. Like it's probably just because I'm really excited about something. And I haven't for most of my career, in fact, even long before Sentry. I will once in a while put in really long hours, and once in a while you would have stuff that just goes wrong and you got to deal with it. Like there's an incident or something, right? But I think the reality is the way I often hear people articulate work-life balance is like, oh, when I leave the job at 5 o'clock or whatever, I disconnect from everything. And it's like, you can't do that. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in any high-paying job in the world, mind you, right? And that's fine. Not everybody wants that. But like, there are compromises you have to make. If you want sort of a high-profile job or a high-ambition job or a high-salary job, you're probably going to have to change how your work like fits into your life, right? And so mine has always been, I will take time off and I'll balance my schedule and I'll do work when it needs to get done. But as an example, during this winter, like there were Fridays where I just like took the day off and skied. And I was able to do that because I compressed all of my work into other days during the week. Or I made up some of the async work over the weekend or in the evenings or something like that, right? Like, because like I just always think about like work has to get done or like the stuff has to get done one way or another. But it's usually not so time consuming if you're sort of smart about how you spend the time. Again, other than like a few situations. And so I wouldn't say I have a good balance between work and life. I spend a lot of time in front of a screen. And if it's not a computer, it's like a phone screen, mind you. But I don't necessarily spend all day working. Like my wife actually probably spends more hours working than I do. But I spend like sort of more off hours, like working or doing work stuff, right? Whether it's like interacting with sort of community folks or travel for work to do networking or responding to emails at midnight or things like that. I may be like responding to emails at midnight and not have done anything from like, 4 to 9 p.m. or something like that, right? And so again, you end up balancing it out a little bit here and there, but balance doesn't necessarily look like what I think a lot of people would expect it to look like, where I can just kind of shut off. It's like, I can't actually ever shut off. It's actually really annoying because going on vacation, I can get away with it. I can completely turn things off. But if I were to say go backpacking for 3 weeks, I would come back to a mountain of emails that I would be miserable. And so even when I like take PTO or something, I'll often say when the day's done or something, I'll just like go through and archive all the emails that I don't need to deal with, just to make it so I don't have a backlog of work when I come back. And that's kind of annoying. Like I'm not happy about that situation in life, but it's fine, And I also think when people think about this, like nobody should pity somebody like me. In fact, you should say that seems fine because you probably get paid a lot of money because you are a founder of a successful company, right? And that's how I think about the compromise. Like I've been very fortunate in life at this point, especially, and like I made some trade-offs to become this fortunate. I guess it didn't actually have to turn out this way. It could have gone the other way, but like it's a risk you take. And so I think it ends up balancing itself out. And I think later career, you find more of that balance. Whereas early career, all I would do all day long is write code. Whether it's work, side project, anything. I had nothing else going on. Later career, I have a lot more going on. So I don't know.
What is the last piece of code that you personally wrote, and when was it?
At Sentry or in general?
General.
I write a lot of code. I wrote a bunch of code yesterday. I wrote some code this morning. I I'm big into whiskey. And so I have this side product. I talked about this thing that Sentry uses dog food. I have this like whiskey, over-engineered whiskey website, basically. And so I've been spending a lot of time on that. And it's a way for me to try new technology and stuff. Like, as an example, I spent a lot of time writing like a scraper. It basically tries to create a database out of like, just imagine all the whiskey in the world. And it uses LLMs to populate it. It uses Google APIs to populate it and all this other stuff. And so I will say I don't regularly write code. I'll go in like spurts because like, again, that high and low kind of thing. I'll just get energized, motivated, something to do it. But yeah, once in a while, I still write a lot of code. I don't know if I'm good at it anymore or not. It's really confusing because I seem to fight with technology a lot more than I used to. But I'm actually not sure if that's my fault or technology's fault.
All the whiskey's fault, right?
Or the whiskey's fault, yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Lots of fun. So I as a closing question, I still have a little surprise for you. I don't know if you knew, but your press team told me a bit about a hidden Easter egg in Sentry, in the Sentry interface, which is called the time machine. And I think you personally built that years ago, and it's still hidden, unreleased. And I kind of discovered that like in that pre-release and experimented with it for a while. And I now want us to try that time machine feature. And we now have the chance to enter the year 2013 when you yourself worked as a software engineer at Dropbox, like way before Sentry. And we travel back in time. And you actually have the chance to whisper something into young David's ears. What would it be?
I don't know. Actually, it's tough. Again, I go back to this paradox. I do think like here's the one advice I would have for myself in probably almost every situation in life, and it's like take more risk because the risk is arguably very little in most things in life. And even when we bootstrapped, like. I could have like taken risk earlier and like maybe saved some money or something, started it earlier, changed things. Or when I made career decisions, it took me a long time to leave a job I was unhappy at, for an example, take more risks. You know, I was like, oh, but like maybe it'll be hard to find another good job or something like that. And so I don't know. It's got to be that. It's the one thing that I think would only have positive influence on my life, you know, that without completely changing who I am, I guess.
Thanks a lot. Good advice. Take more risks. Don't be shy to fail. Eh? David, was a lot of fun.
Exactly.
Talking to you, and I hope that we will have the chance again in the future. And I wish you best of luck for Sentry in the future and the next 15 years, let's say. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.